Did they ever meet, or is this just through books that he was influenced?
It was through books. I believe she died somewhere in there. He was already born, but I don't believe that they ever met. It was just through her writings that he was introduced to
You
it.
may not know the answer to this. There's a rumor that that his mother had an affair and that Hitler was half Jewish. Have you ever heard that? Any truth
I've heard
to
that rumor. I haven't spent the time to research that, to look into that, so it may be true, it might not be. I don't know. But somewhere along the way, he developed a strong hatred for the Jews. And something else, to show you how superstitious he was, how spiritually, in a negative kind of way, when I say spiritually, occultically inclined he was, he brought several dozen Buddhist monks to Berlin, and their assignment was to meditate on his behalf around the clock. I'm talking about occult meditation here.
Wow.
Because he believed that would, again, help protect him and help give him the power and energy to bring in the
occult version of prayer
Third
warriors.
Reich. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, Hitler believed in that very much so. But we know it all imploded on him in the end. But as a result of everything that happened during World War II, what happened afterwards? The United Nations was established. And people need to be aware of that. After the World Wars, the first one, it led to the forming of the League of Nations, the first big political step publicly toward the beginnings of a world government. And then after World War II came the United Nations. So I've always felt personally, this is my opinion, that there's going to be some type of, at the very least, major conflict in the Middle East, if not a world war, and possibly this one world government being ushered in on the backside of that as a solution to keep world peace so something like this doesn't ever happen
and just like
again.
anything else, these bad things come across looking good or for a good purpose. And the United Nations was brought in. Look, we don't want another world war. Let's start this United Nations.
It's all done in the name of peace.
We'll stop the world from going to war again. How it hasn't turned out.
In their Bible verse it says, when they say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh. So people need to be aware of that.
So that's Helena. Did you have any more on her? Or do you want to go on to another one here?
Well, she had a huge influence on the beginnings of the New Age movement. But really, it was Alice Bailey who came after her, who was a subsequent leader of the Theosophical Society, just like Blavatsky was. Alice Bailey, I think, had an even bigger influence, and today most frequently is referred to as the mother of the New Age movement.
All right, before we get to Alice, let me tell the folks how they can get your book. And we're going to talk about Alice Bailey, because that's a name that a lot of us have heard of. This Helena is someone I'd never heard of before. Can't even say her name. But she's a pretty important person in the history of the upbringing of Hitler.
Yeah.
And but Alice Bailey, somebody a lot of us have heard of. We're going to talk about her next. You can get your copy of Brother Gary Carr's book, and I would recommend you get this, The New World Religion. How many pages here?
Around 300.
300 and some pages. Yep. Well documented. This is a guy that documents stuff and has.
We have a thorough appendix
look at all that.
section
Look at
as
that.
well.
All these stuff in here. So go to the website, prophecynews.com. You can get your book that way with by going online, or during regular business hours, dial the 800 number on your screen. All right, brother. Let's move on here. Let's talk about Alice Bailey.
Okay, and before we do, just that Lucifer magazine copy that I showed, I want to give credit to a great researcher out of North Carolina, Dennis Cuddy. He used to work for the U.S. Department of Education, and he came across a lot of this stuff through his work there, and I was able to get that through him. Okay. And that's how the Lord's blessed us over the years, through various researchers funneling information to us. And like I said in last week's interview, I was actually involved in two of the organizations directly. So the information was funneled to me in a lot of different directions, none of which I can take credit for.
So what we're saying here is, before we get to Alice, we're saying that the global system is here. It's coming.
It's coming.
It's going to be a one world order. But this global system has as its foundation a religious backing. Yes. And you're saying there's some people who influenced that. This Helena was one of them that influenced Adolf Hitler. And Alice Bailey is another big character here.
Correct.
So tell us about her.
All right. Alice Bailey was a big theosophist. She was also a female Freemason, and her husband was very involved in Freemasonry. In fact, at one point in time, they were on the Masonic lecture circuit. They actually traveled around the country and spoke at some of the lodges. And according to her husband, Foster, she would go into a room, go into a trance, an altered state of consciousness, a form of occult meditation, and her spirit guide would appear to her. She had a name for this entity. She referred to him by two names, actually, Dwalkul, and sometimes she simply referred to him as the Tibetan master.
Wow.
She believed he resided in the region of Tibet, and that when she would go into an altered state, she could summon him as a spirit, and then he would communicate with her. And according to her husband, she'd go into a room, be in there for 2 or 3 days, and come out with a manuscript completely finished for a book, allegedly just dictated to her by this, what I call a demonic spirit.
Mm-hmm.
And so it should not have been a surprise to anyone when, in the early 1920s, she founded a publishing house and named it Lucifer Publishing Company. Again, if people have a hard time believing it, on page 31 of my book, I have one of the title pages from one of her first books, The Consciousness of the Atom, and down near the bottom, you can see it says Lucifer Publishing Company, 135 Broadway, New York City. Now, smartly on her part, she changed the name 2 years later to Lucis Trust. That organization still exists today. It has had quite an impact at the United Nations behind the scenes. People are not aware of that. And a lot of different political figures have had a favorable view of Lucis Trust and have moved in those circles. It may be a coincidence, it might not be a coincidence that the Council on Foreign Relations was founded around the same time in New York City, with a lot of money coming from the Rockefeller family. And behind the scenes, they helped to support a lot of organizations that were pushing this one world, interfaith, New Age agenda. But Alice Bailey, she wrote multiple books. They are today your occult classics. You can go into any bookstore. If they don't have them on the shelves, they can be ordered. I mean, they've made a huge comeback. But back in the day, you had to belong to the Theosophical Society or another related secret society to be able to get these books. They were considered off limits to the general public because they were so heavily occultic. And so in the back of my book, The New World Religion, in Appendix A, all I did was reproduce some of the quotes from Alice Bailey's books that showed how anti-Jewish and anti-Christian she was. So if there's any doubt in any people's minds, all you need to do is look at those quotes coming straight from her books. She also was a big supporter of Adolf Hitler. Yeah. And so, again, this New Age movement was right in line with the movement of the Nazis. It was actually there was a spiritual component to Nazism. And these people dabbled heavily in the occult. But then after World War II especially, this agenda began establishing a foothold in the United States. A lot of groundwork being laid in the late 40s and early 50s and then heading into the 60s.
Yeah, and later on, I mean, it's obvious to me that the church dropped the ball. God's people dropped the ball. The preachers, the men of God of our country, have dropped the ball. They've quit preaching against sin. They've quit preaching the truth. We used to have book burnings, revivals. You've read about them. You won't hear about them anymore, but you read about them. People, I mean, all the way in the back to the book of Acts, they had them. They brought their occultic stuff and they burned them. And I've heard of that in past generations and of revivals that broke out in America. They'd burn books that were no good. They'd get rid of their Ouija boards and all that junk. Mm-hmm. That's kind of gone now, isn't it? And it seems like because we're not pushing the truth, the error has come in.
I think a lot of Christian leaders, especially back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, underestimated the hidden power of this movement. They didn't realize how powerful it already was beneath the surface. And Americans tend to react only once their backs are to the wall. If we have a major flaw, that's one of them. Yeah. And so, if people would have listened even 30 years ago when I was starting to talk about this stuff and doing programs on it and warning people, and some did, thankfully, but a lot of people thought, this will never happen in the United States. And now look, the latest survey I saw, 45% of Americans now are more closely aligned with socialism than the free enterprise system. I mean, we're approaching the halfway mark. We're not far away.
I mean, we got them in Congress now. Give the folks your website so I don't forget, and
Yes.
Rex will put it on the screen. But,
yeah, people can read some of our articles, and also we have
you have a newsletter that people can sign
yes,
up
we have a
for.
research news journal that I write articles for on a regular basis, and they can get that from our website, which is www.garykaw.org. And again, my last name is spelled K-A-H.
Yep, and he'll put that up on the
All
screen
right.
for them. And we're not going to have enough time, but there's a couple things I don't want to miss here. Hollywood seems to be obsessed with the occult and extraterrestrials and monsters, and comment on that. Why is that?
Well, okay, a good friend of mine used to be a producer in Hollywood, and he was a co-producer of a regular series that ran for about 8 or 10 years. It was very popular. And through his experience, he is a Christian, but through his experience in Hollywood, he got to know some of the Hollywood producers. And he shared with me some of the names of the producers that had made it a mandatory requirement that people working on their creative staffs are involved in at least one form of occult meditation. And that explains a lot. You know, I've wondered for years, how in the world can even human mind even conceptualize and come up with some of these things in these occult, extraterrestrial-oriented movies? And I've concluded that if these people, if the creative staff is involved in occult meditation, they may simply be regurgitating what they are seeing on the other side when they're in their trance states. I think they're showing in these movies portions of occult visions that they are having. And so without even realizing it, a lot of people are watching demonic manifestations on their movie screens. I really believe that. And I think it's all part of a conditioning. People are so into extraterrestrials now, about 1 out of every 3 or 4 movies coming out deals with extraterrestrials or spirit beings, but people aren't making the connections. These New Agers, these one-worlders, they're smart. And so rather than calling these beings demons, they just call them extraterrestrials, because a majority of the U.S. population believes in extraterrestrials. They believe in evolution. And so the thought is, well, if we've evolved here, who's to say that there aren't higher life forms that have evolved somewhere else that can communicate to us in ways that we cannot yet comprehend?
And eventually,
and
these
they fall
people,
for it,
maybe,
a demonic deception.
Maybe these extraterrestrials will come and save us.
That's what some
Maybe
of these
they'll take
people are
all
teaching.
the bad people off the earth.
We need to unify the world and come together to save the planet, you know, and
well, we're out of time, but my goodness,
that went
Brother
fast.
Gary, this was fun. It seems like the occult draws people. There's something exciting about it.
If I would say anything to people, I would say, remember that God is sovereign, that He is much more powerful than Satan, but we are in a spiritual battle. And we need to remember that we are on the winning team, and we need to be exposing the works of darkness so that people don't fall into these traps of the enemy.
But until next time, keep looking up.